Before we get started, I do want to let everybody know that those of you who turned in revised papers, I have looked over and graded the revisions, so the revised grade is posted in Georgia View. It just replaced the original grade. So if you log in and check out the feedback and the grade for the original paper, it'll be replaced now by the new feedback. So that's done. Now, as far as this piece of music that I was playing for you is concerned, have any of you heard this before? Sound familiar to any of you? A little bit?
A long time.
Okay, yeah. And this is one of the most familiar pieces of music based on content from the 1001 Nights. It's what's called a tone poem. And a tone poem is a piece of music that intends to evoke content from a story, a poem, a landscape, essentially any sort of non-musical aesthetic object, right? It's trying to evoke another aesthetic object, whether literary or visual. I can very clearly remember when I first heard this piece of music. It's the theme music for an old computer game called Alibaba and the 40 Thieves that we got when I was a kid. When I was about 6 or 7 years old, we got an Apple computer. And my father stayed awake for about 2 weeks straight trying to finish this game. It's this sort of little labyrinth where you try to move this little pixelated character around and find this princess and bring her back to her father, the Sultan. And it's loaded with references to Middle Eastern history and to folklore, the 1001 Nights, Arabic mythology, other such things. So he would come home from his job at the power plant. He'd eat his dinner in front of the computer. He would sit there all night. And when his carpool came in the morning, get up, save the game, go to work, come back, repeat process, until he finally just bought a map from somebody that told him where the damn princess was. So, the reason I tell you this story is because it also has a lot to do with reception of the 1001 Nights in the West, right? Now, all of you probably have some level of familiarity with the 1001 Nights, or sometimes called the Arabian Nights, right? So, what do you already know about this text? What is familiar about it to you? Yeah, Frank.
One we probably already know is the Tale of Aladdin.
Okay, yeah, Aladdin. Okay, other stories that you're already familiar with? What are some of the most famous tales that are taken out of 1001 Nights? Aladdin is probably the best known to us because of the damn cartoon, right?
Yeah.
I watched the movie over it. There was Aladdin, Aladdin was Aladdin too.
Okay, yeah, there are.
It was kind of funny.
They really tried to milk that Aladdin thing, yeah. What about stories about a sailor? Anybody familiar with
Sinbad?
Sinbad, yes, yes. Not especially funny '80s comedian, but the sailor, right? Sinbad the sailor, right? I just mentioned one of the most famous stories as well, right? What was that computer game my dad wasted half his life playing?
The 40 Thieves.
Alibaba and the 40 Thieves, yep. So these are probably the best known tales from this collection, in the West anyway. So you would expect, right, an excerpt in an anthology would be mostly highlights from the text. So why doesn't it include any of these stories?
Everybody already knows it, I guess. Maybe.
That could be one explanation, right? The excerpt that we've got here is based on the earliest complete text of the Nights, which is a 14th century Syrian manuscript. Now, the editors of this anthology have not, in the past, shied away from giving you parts of a famous text that you probably already know.
So the other stories were like added later, you think?
Yeah, these were not part of the original collection. In 1704, a Frenchman by the name of Antoine Galland got a hold of a collection of Middle Eastern folk tales that included a frame story about a violent king murdering his wives, and a brave young noblewoman who kind of works her mojo on him to get him to stop, right? Now, Galland took the title literally, and so assumed, okay, it's called The 1001 Nights, there must be 1001 stories, ergo, the text I have must be incomplete. So he looked around to find Arabic scholars, Arabic travelers to speak to, in his own home in Paris, and collected other folk tales from them. He collected folk tales from northern India, from Persia, from North Africa, right, from various parts of the Islamic world, and added them to the original collection of tales. So Aladdin is actually an Indian folk tale. The story originally had nothing to, there's a little guy who shows up at the beginning of the movie, right, singing about Arabian Nights and Arabian Days and all that, yeah. The original folktale has nothing to do with the Arabian Peninsula in any way, shape, or form. It's an Indian story. Ali Baba is an Arabic folktale. And Sinbad seems to have been pure invention. Right? Most of the adventures of Sinbad are suspiciously similar to episodes from the Odyssey, kind of dressed up in Middle Eastern garb. So Galland's translation with these additions was an enormous hit throughout Europe, and unauthorized editions in other languages started appearing within 2 years of his original publication. Most of the versions of the Nights that we would be familiar with come from 19th century British translations. The earliest is by a guy named Edward Lane, roughly 1840, dates to roughly 1840. And what Lane did was take most of the violence and most of the sex out of the text. So it's a kind of watered down version. Yeah, Frank?
Was that during the period of Victorian censorship?
Yeah, well, not censorship per se, but there was certainly a sense of, that some of these stories didn't quite meet the level of propriety expected of a gentleman. So yeah, so he essentially makes a kind of family-friendly version of the Nights. And of course, whenever you try to make something family-friendly, right, you tend to make it suck. So, a little later on, another eminent Victorian by the name of Sir Richard Burton takes Lane's translation, puts all of the sex and violence back in, and turns them up to 11. So what Burton's translation in particular is typical of is the way Westerners have often received the culture, particularly the popular culture, of the Middle East, North Africa, and India. Right? There's a guy by the name of Edward Said. He was a Palestinian-American literary critic. Wrote a book called Orientalism. Now, Orientalism used to be an academic discipline. Got underway in the 19th century, primarily in Europe, in France, in England, even in the United States. And Orientalists studied the history and culture primarily of the Near East, though there were also some who studied East Asia. And what Said argues is that these Western scholars looking at the East use this sort of discoursive control to differentiate Western and Eastern cultures and to make Western culture appear superior through a sort of process of projection, right? So if the Westerner, the Englishman in particular maybe, sees himself as chaste, then the Easterner must be promiscuous. If the Westerner sees himself as industrious, then he will depict the Easterner as lazy. If the Westerner sees himself as thrifty, he will portray the Easterner as a profligate spender. Get how this works? So what we end up with in Western depictions of Persia, India, the Arab world in the 19th century are this kind of a lush, sexy, lazy, decadent atmosphere. Right. I'll give you an example of this, of actually how these sort of discourses persist into the 20th century. Let me just call this up quickly. There we go. Okay, so I just want you to, I'm going to put an image up on the screen here, and I want you to tell me what you notice about it. How the image is constructed. Once it appears. Yeah, secret.
She seems to be more sexual.
Yeah, okay, yeah. The obvious, right, would be the outfit, right? Yeah, what do we notice about what she's wearing? Okay. Yeah, on the one hand, it's like it's ornate, right? There are all kinds of little baubles and bangles, right? Sort of elaborate dye work and stitch work on what she's wearing. And there's not very much of it, right? So it's a skimpy costume, but it's also very ornate. Yeah, very sexualized portrayal of a Middle Eastern woman, right? What else do we notice there? Like just, and don't just focus on her, focus on sort of what's around her as well. Yeah, we got these really ornate cornices on the columns, right? With all this, intense scroll work. Good. What else? What about the color scheme in the image?
There's a lot of flashy reds and blues and just bright colors.
Yeah, bright colors everywhere. What seems to be sort of the general condition of the building around her? It's ornate, right? But it looks old. Yeah, it looks like it's aging. right? So it's like we spent a lot of effort making this pretty, but not actually maintaining it or keeping it up. Now, the actress in this picture, her name is Caroline Monroe, and she's best known for having been a Bond girl. The movie this is taken from is called The Golden Voyage of Sinbad. And of course, with a name like Caroline Monroe, right, this is not a Middle Eastern name, right? Does this actress look like she is in fact Arabic or North African? Absolutely not, right? No, she is. She's English. So they've dressed up an English woman in a kind of sexy Arabic slave girl costume, right, which would not pass any actual modesty tests in a contemporary Middle Eastern culture, right? To create this kind of lush, exotic image of what the Middle East is supposed to be like. You know, this is not that long ago. I think this movie was made in 1972. So not within any of our lifetimes, but close enough. So these kinds of discourses do persist. And the way we view the Middle East is shaped by our experience of Middle Eastern culture, which is often limited and sort of mediated through the work of people like Antoine Galland and Sir Richard Burton, right? These early Orientalists who have shaped the way Westerners see the Middle East. All right, so that's enough of that. So would it be accurate to say that Galland's text is inauthentic for adding these extra stories? Why would you say no, Frank?
Well, they had these 3 stories, but the hundreds of others they found were still original stories. He went and make stuff up other than these 3, and he's probably not the one who made these 3 up. He went to,
he didn't make these stories up.
Middle Eastern scholars, people who came from there and asked them their traditions and legends, and just wrote them down as they told them.
These
it wasn't really him that was making the changes.
Yeah, these are authentic stories. They're not originally part of this particular collection, or at least not originally part of the first complete version of it that we have. But they're authentic stories. Not only that, like, we tend to conceive of a text as a sort of single unified entity from the moment it first appears, right? I mean, like, if you go out and buy, you know, a Stephen King novel, right? There's one version of that Stephen King novel, right? One version that is authorized by the writer, one version that gets published and all the royalties go to him and his publisher, yeah? Early popular literature doesn't work that way. The original manuscript of The 1001 Nights, I mean, one could argue it doesn't have an author, one could have it has hundreds, one could argue it has hundreds of authors. And different versions of the collection, even different authentic versions of the collection, contain different tales. What we have here is not a treasured epic that has been passed down orally over time in more or less the same form. We don't have a long court poem on a historical subject like the Shahnameh was, right? We don't have a religious text that is meant to sort of shape the beliefs of the people and tell them how to live their lives. What we have here is, it's almost like the medieval Arabic equivalent of comics. Right? How many of you read comics? Anybody? Okay, a couple of you do, right? And comics will often go back and revise a particular character's history or origin story, right? If it suits them to tell a different kind of story. Does anybody know what that process is called? When you go back and say, give a hero a different origin or change a villain's history? It's called retconning. And popular texts in the ancient medieval worlds did this sort of thing all the time. Galan's version of the Knights is in a lot of ways as authentic as anybody's, because there is no single authentic version. Each compendium of these tales is a little bit different. Yeah, Frank?
Did this tale originally, you think it came out of just oral tradition and was written down by someone?
Yeah, I mean, most of these tales would have come out of oral tradition, right?
So this was just a series of folk tales that people spoke, and you have to think in different regions they would have had variations.
Yeah, absolutely.
Then one person wrote down one copy and another person wrote down another copy, and that would explain the just base differences in it.
And not only that, I mean, like, different versions of the collection contain different tales. The frame story usually remains more or less the same. And the frame story, we think, is probably of Persian origin. A lot of the tales are probably of Persian origin, for a couple of reasons. One, there should be an eraser here somewhere. Yes, here we go. The names of the characters in the frame story. Right, Shahryar, Shahzaman, Shahrazad, Dinarzad. These are not Arabic names. They're Persian names. In fact, does anybody recognize what this first syllable of the first three names means from our discussion of the Shahnameh last time? What does Shahnameh translate to from Farsi to English?
The highest state of official, like administrator or something.
I think you're thinking of a vizier. What does Shahnameh mean in Farsi? Pardon? Nope, nothing to do with God. Book of Kings, yeah. Shah means king. Now, the other reason we think the frame story, and many of the other stories are of Persian origin rather than Arabic, is that Arabic and Persian were used in the Islamic world for different purposes. Because Arabic was the language of the Quran, it was regarded as sacred. And so, you should not write about trivial things in the sacred language. That would pollute it. So Persian was often used for imaginative literature. Just as a lot of like these sort of figurative art traditions of the Middle East are Persian rather than Arabic because no idolatry, right? Imaginative literature was also written primarily in Persian. Now the frame story actually locates us in a Persian context as well. If we look on page 1176, the story of King Shahryar and Shahrazad, his vizier's daughter. It is related, but God knows and sees best what lies hidden in the old accounts of bygone peoples and times, that long ago, during the time of the Sassanid Dynasty, in the peninsulas of India and Indochina, there lived two kings who were brothers. So this locates it directly in the dynasty that ruled Persia just before the Arab conquest, right? This empire that rivaled the Byzantines. right, that struggled with the Byzantines for control of the Arabian Peninsula. Now, this leads to a number of anachronisms in the text. One, the Sassanid Dynasty, as we know, was predominantly pre-Islamic, particularly if you're going way, way back in history, the Sassanid Dynasty. And yet, we see most of the characters in this text acting like Muslims, right? Obeying those 5 pillars of Islam that we talked about, right? They follow the festivals they're supposed to. They make the declaration of faith at various times. And they, characters are rewarded for doing things like giving alms to the poor, right? So this is supposed to be taking place in a pre-Islamic dynasty in Persia, in the far reaches of the Persian Empire. But the characters instead act like medieval Muslims. Now, there are other anachronisms that we'd see as well. If we had more of the tales, there's a large collection of these tales that focus on the deeds of a famous caliph by the name of Harun al-Rashid. This would translate from Arabic to Aaron the Just, Harun al-Rashid. Now, does anybody know what a caliph is or was? Well, was. There aren't any anymore.
Leader of the Muslim empire back then.
Yeah, it was. He was both the political and spiritual leader. So, sort of combined function, like if you combine the functions of an emperor and a pope, that's essentially what the caliph was. What the caliph did. Now, Harun al-Rashid ruled from 786 to 809 from Baghdad. So after the Sassanids were already long gone. So there are stories that are in the collection that Shahrazad is telling, right, the events of which could only have occurred long after Shahrazad herself would have been dead. Right, but the frame story is really just kind of an imaginative construct that provides a thematic unity to the stories. It's not meant to be historically accurate, right? Again, remember, this is popular literature, right? This is just the sort of stuff, the sort of stories that people would be telling in their homes at night, the sort of stories people would be going to the marketplace to hear. This is popular entertainment. Right? They didn't have Xbox. So, did you notice anything in this frame story that really struck you? The story of these two brothers and their dealings with their wives. Yeah, Secret.
What I noticed, I got from the text that women were kind of becoming, I don't want to say independent, but doing as they wish to, and not really being under men's control. So I guess it is independent.
Okay. Can you give me an example of what you're talking about?
Okay. I guess with the quote on page 1181.
Okay.
When the demon prisoner or wife has said women desire something, no one can stop her.
Yeah.
Or something. And that just constructs of what the whole story is about. Even with the visor's daughter, oldest daughter, it signifies that women create the predicament and how for the men in the story, the 3 old men, and they just do whatever they say don't do it, they still did it.
So women create the predicaments for the 3 old men, right? Mm-hmm. But then who fixes the 3 old men's predicaments?
The women.
Other women, yeah. So, do all women, according to the logic of the text, seem to be motivated by the same sorts of things that motivate the demon's wife? And by the way, just so you know, the way this text uses the word demon, right? We're not talking about fallen angels here. This is just the way the translator is translating the word jinn. Which you might be more familiar with as a genie. So these are these spirits from Arabic folklore of great power. Right? They can do magic, way more powerful than humans, and some are good and some are bad. Right? Some the jinn are regarded as having been created by Allah, along with everything else, and some follow him and some do not. Right? Good genies follow Allah, bad genies reject Allah. So demons are not, we're not talking about devils here. We're talking about something else entirely, another class of being. Yeah, Taylor.
I noticed a lot of like magic and spiritual things going on throughout the stories.
Uh-huh.
Is that common? Because I know in Greek there was quite a bit of that, but is that common in these types of texts?
Yeah, we do see. Who do we see typically using magic here?
Women. That's what I was.
Yeah, almost exclusively women, right? And what sorts of things do they do? Like, are we talking about magic like I draw a circle on the ground and wave a staff around and say some words?
Like turning things into people like animals?
Yeah, a lot of transformation. They're turning people into animals. Yeah, Jalen.
I was just going to say what I thought was, what I interpreted it was the men's tales, the old men, how they kept, well, the first one, I think it was it his wife that he turned into a deer or something?
Mm-hmm.
And then another one, his son, a bull or something like that.
Yeah, his mistress and son get turned into cows. His wife gets turned into a deer. The second old man, his brothers get turned into dogs. And with the third old man, his wife gets turned into a mule. Right, so yeah, so all of these involve sort of human to animal transformations. And usually, the woman performing the spell has to, do some sort of, like, use some kind of physical object, like I splash water on it, or some such thing, right, to affect the transformation. So I think there is something here of that. Where else have we seen sorceresses turning people into animals?
In Greek mythology.
Yeah, we've seen this in Greek mythology, right? Circe. The same idea of sort of the polypharmacon, right? I use, drugs and herbs and water and things to practice magic. So I think that we are seeing, some influence here of Greek myth.
I thought it was kind of Greekish how it was like set up too, with the women being separate in the house.
Yeah, and that's also that's still common in the Middle East. Like the way a home is usually set up, the women live together in a particular part of the house, and the men live in another part of the house. So women and men in a lot of Middle Eastern cultures do still live apart, in the same house, but apart. The women's part of the house is what is sometimes called. In a noble house, it used to be called a harem. I saw somebody else had a hand up a second ago, wanted to say something. Have we changed our minds? Yes? Okay. All right, so let's sort of go back to that initial incident for a moment that Secret pointed out to us about the demon and his wife, right? Now, does that seem to be part of a chain of incidents in the early part of the story?
Yeah.
Pardon?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Can you explain the chain then, Jamie?
Well, I mean, it's like the first one guy's like, well, my wife's cheating on me. It's terrible.
Uh-huh.
There can be no greater
Yes.
loss than mine.
Surely this has never happened to anyone else. Yes.
And then he goes to his brother and he sees his brother's being cheated on, and not only that, like all his concubines are cheating on him also. So he's like, oh, well, he tells him, and he's like, oh, you know.
Yes, so each time the situation gets slightly more extreme, right? When Shahzaman, the younger brother, catches his wife, in what situation does he catch her?
He's getting ready to leave to meet his brother. He goes back in, he forgot his keys or something, goes back in, and finds his wife home sleeping with the cook.
Yes, with the kid, not even with the cook, with the kitchen boy.
Oh,
yes.
well.
Yes, his wife is sleeping with the kitchen boy.
Daddy left us idiot.
Yep.
I mean, bad.
Now, what about Shahryar, the older brother? What's going on with his wife and all of his slave girls?
All of them are having fun.
They're all enjoying themselves when he's not around to watch. With who?
Black slaves.
With slaves, yeah. If we look on page 1178 here, right? After his brother's departure, Shahzaman stayed in the palace and from the window overlooking the garden watched the birds and trees as he thought of his wife and what she had done to him and sighed in sorrow. While he agonized over his misfortune, gazing at the heavens and turning a distracted eye on the garden, the private gate of his brother's palace opened. And there emerged, strutting like a dark-eyed deer, the lady, his brother's wife, with 20 slave girls, 10 white and 10 black. When Shahzaman looked at them, without being seen, they continued to walk until they stopped below his window without looking in his direction, thinking that he had gone to the hunt with his brother. Then they sat down, took off their clothes, and suddenly there were 10 slave girls and 10 black slaves dressed in the same clothes as the girls. Then the 10 black slaves mounted the 10 girls with a lady called Masood, and a black slave jumped from the tree to the ground, rushed to her, and raising her legs up between her thighs and made love to her. Masood topped the lady, while the 10 slaves topped the 10 girls, and they carried on till noon. When they were done with their business, they got up and washed themselves. The 10 slaves put on the same clothes again, right? So, what's the similarity here in the situations, apart from the fact that the wives and concubines are having sex with someone else?
Having sex with people of low stature.
Yes, exactly. They're
Were the
mixed.
slaves male? I was confused about that.
Yeah, the slaves are. The slaves are men disguised as women.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Yeah. And she even allows Masood to verbally abuse her at one point. Or if you look on page 1180, right, as for the lady, she called Masood, and a black slave jumped from the tree to the ground and came to her and said, "What do you want, you slut? Here is Saad al-Din Masood." So this seems like rather a saucy way for a slave to talk to a noblewoman, right? Now, what about the demon and his wife? What's the situation there?
The demon was trying to like protect her and keep her pure and virtue.
Yeah. He's trying to make sure that she doesn't mess around with anybody else. And how does he accomplish this?
Chain her up.
Yeah, he keeps her locked in a box, right? He keeps her locked up in a box, which he stores in the middle of a lake. And he only goes down and takes her out now and again, right? And this is all to protect her virtue, to protect her purity, when he stole her in the first place on her wedding night. And so she demands that the two brothers have sex with her, or she's going to tell the demon and he's going to kill them. Right? So, why is it that these women are cavorting with people of lower class than themselves and their husbands? What are they reacting? What common situation are they reacting to? What's the story of the demon's wife supposed to point out?
They're all trapped.
They were with the people they loved.
Yeah, they're trapped. They're treated like prisoners. They're treated like slaves, right? And as such, they gravitate towards people who are in the same situation. Now, does Shahryar take the right lesson from this? Right, we look on page 1182. They turned their backs and took to the road. Then Shahryar turned to his brother and said, "My brother Shahzaman, look at this sorry plight. By God, it is worse than ours. This is no less than a demon who has carried a young woman away on her wedding night, imprisoned her in a glass chest, locked her up with 4 locks, and kept her in the middle of the sea, thinking that he could guard her from what God had foreordained. And you saw how she has managed to sleep with 98 men, and added the 2 of us to make 100. Brother, let us go back to our kingdoms and our cities, never to marry a woman again. As for myself, I shall show you what I will do." Then the 2 brothers headed home and journeyed until nightfall. On the morning of the 3rd day, they reached their camp, and men entered their tent and sat on their thrones. The chamberlains, deputies, princes, and viziers came to attend King Shahryar, while he gave orders and bestowed robes of honor as well as other gifts. Then at his command, everyone returned to the city, and he went to his own palace and ordered his chief vizier, the father of the 2 girls, Shahrazad and Dinarzad, who will be mentioned below, and said to him, "Take that wife of mine and put her to death." Then Shahryar went to her himself, bound her, and handed her over to the vizier, who took her out and put her to death. Then King Shahryar grabbed his sword, brandished it, and entering the palace chambers, killed every one of his slave girls and replaced them with others. He then swore to marry for 1 night only and kill the woman the next morning, in order to save himself from the wickedness and cunning of women, saying, "There is not a single chaste woman anywhere on the entire face of the earth." Shortly thereafter, he provided his brother Shahzaman with supplies for his journey and sent him back to his own country with gifts, rarities, and money. The brother bade him goodbye and set out for home. All right. Yeah, secret.
Okay, I just noticed this.
Uh-huh.
But why is it that he kills the females, like the female slaves and the wives, but not Nazaru or the men slaves for their wives?
Yeah, he only kills women, right? Well, who does he blame?
His wife.
Yeah. What the example of the demon's wife has taught him, right, is that all women are cunning and deceitful. And if you do not treat them like a tyrant, if you do not exercise the tightest possible control over them, then they'll get one over on you, and they'll humiliate you. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Is that the same reference with the donkey and the ox when he says he has to manage the wife?
With the rooster going from hen to hen tells the dog, that yes, our master simply doesn't know how to manage his wife. Yeah, the vizier is trying to teach the same lesson to his daughter, right? That the way to manage women is with the threat of violence. Exactly what Shahryar is doing to his wife and to his slave girls, right? Keep them in line with threat of death. Now, does the text itself, does the story itself seem to endorse that particular viewpoint? If we look at the story of the merchant and the demon, and the stories of the 3 old men, the merchant want to do to the? What does the demon want to do to the merchant? Yeah, he wants to kill him. And why does he want to kill him?
Doesn't kill his son.
Yeah, in vengeance for the demon's son, whom the merchant has killed. Right? The merchant he's riding his donkey through the through the oasis. He's eating dates. He's carelessly throwing the pits over his shoulder, and one of those pits happens to hit the demon's son and kills him. Right now, if the kid could be killed by a flying date pit, probably not the strongest constitution in the world anyway, right?
Survival of fittest.
Yeah.
A stiff wind hit him.
Yeah. But at any rate, did the merchant have any idea that the demon's son was there? No. He couldn't see, the demon admits his son was walking invisible, right? There was no possible way for this guy to know the demon's son was there. No possible way for him to know that throwing a random date pit in some direction was going to kill anyone. But the demon insists on punishing him anyway. Right? I don't care that you did this by accident. I don't care that you didn't mean to offend me. I'm still going to kill you. So, does this kind of arbitrary, unfair threat of violence look like anything else here in the text?
Treatment of women.
Yeah, Shahryar is marrying a different woman every night. Women he doesn't know, women who have never done anything personally to offend him, and killing them the next morning because of what his wife did to him, right? So he takes, I guess sociologists would call this sort of drawing conclusions from too small a sample, right? Because these, the small group of women that he knows have been deceitful. He assumes all women must be deceitful. And so then we get to these stories about these magic women, right? The stories of the three old men. So what happens in the first old man story? Just to briefly rehearse this.
Couldn't bear children.
Mm-hmm.
We got initiatives and she gave them time. She became jealous and turned
Yep.
down.
Yeah. Okay. So who's the villain in the first old man story?
The first one.
The first wife.
Yeah. First wife is the villain. She uses her evil arts to transform the mistress and the son, and then demands that the two of them be offered up in sacrifice, right? And who is it that resolves the problem?
The shepherd. Yeah.
Shepherd's daughter, yep. Yeah, the shepherd's daughter is the real hero because she uses her arts to figure out what's happened and to change the son back and to punish the villain, right? What about the second old man story? He's the guy with the dogs, yep.
Yeah. Kind of like this one brother is frugal and carried money, the other two brothers were wasteful and
Yep.
went off on journeys and came back, all their money was gone.
Mm-hmm.
And then they went, the three of them, they convinced the other brother, the frugal one, to go on the journey with all of them left.
Mhm.
And he met this woman, and they got married. The three brothers were envious and
Uh-huh.
wanted to kill him, and they threw him and his wife overboard the ship. And she saved him, trying to get the
Right. So the hero of the story again is this female demon, right? And the villains, right, are the two brothers who talk their brother into giving them money, who talk their brother into, taking an ill-advised trip. And the second old man, right, is rewarded by the female demon because he follows that principle of generosity, right, the principle of almsgiving. Right? He gives freely to his brothers when they go broke. Right? He is generous enough to pick up the poor urchin girl and dress her and marry her, right? So because he shows, the qualities of a good and generous Muslim, he is rewarded by the female demon. Now, what about the third old man? Again, who's the villain here? Yeah, his wife is the villain. She turns him into a dog. And the hero this time is the butcher's daughter, right? Who recognizes immediately what he is. Hey, that's not a dog. That's a man. Changes him back and changes the conniving wife, whom he caught having sex with someone else, right, into a mule. So, how do these three stories relate to the frame story? What is Shahrazad attempting to do? She's trying to be the hero, yeah. I mean, she has, essentially stated, right, her purpose is to try to cure the king's mania, right, and save all of the other women in the kingdom from getting their heads chopped off morning after morning after morning.
Showing that women are human too, like there's good women and bad women.
Yeah, the damage that's done by bad women in these stories is healed by a good woman. That's exactly what she's trying to do. Yeah, she's trying to demonstrate that that for every wicked woman who wants to get one over on you, there is a good one who wants only to help. And she's sort of trying to teach Shahryar what ought to have been the real lesson of the Demon's Wife episode, right? That the problem is not that women are nasty and conniving. The problem is, like, you try to lock them up in boxes. Stop that. Don't do that. Right? Stop threatening them with violence. It's in a lot of ways, for a medieval text, pretty progressive in its gender attitudes. Right? On the one hand, is Shahrazad dealing entirely honestly with the king? Now, she is deceiving him, right? The text does allow her to deceive him, but she's using this deception to help him and to help every woman in his kingdom, right? Because is he limiting his depredations to noble women? No, yeah, we're told on 1178, right, that he is, he starts, or 1182, right, he starts with the prince's daughters and moves on to the army officers' daughters, merchants' daughters, commoners' daughters, right? So he just keeps going down the social ladder here, right? And applying his violent logic to women of all social classes, of all stations in life. And it is only, right, through the efforts of the learned and cultured Shahrazad that his madness can eventually be cured. All right, does anybody have any questions about any of this or anything else that you want to say about any of this? Yeah, Secret.
About the religion aspect of the
Yeah.
text.
Uh-huh.
It does mention God and Father of the heavens and all the mighty
Right.
and magnificent. Is it like in the Islamic text of God with the Quran or more Christian?
Yeah, well, this would be they're translating Allah as God. Yeah, so this would be Islamic God, not Christian God. But you may notice in the story of the first old man, right? There's a clear play there on the Abraham and Isaac story from the Hebrew Bible, right? Where, he is essentially being told to sacrifice his son on the Feast of Immolation, which is supposed to commemorate Abraham's sacrifice of his son. So we do see them referencing those older Jewish and Christian scriptures that Muslims also revere. Anything else? All right, we're going to be moving to medieval Europe on Wednesday. You're going to be reading the first 11 cantos of Dante's Inferno. All right, so we're going to read ultimately the whole thing, but let's start small, yeah? And once you've got the reading questions, make sure that you give me your in-class writing before you go. And we'll see you on Wednesday.